The sideshow's over. Time for the main event. Hey guys, this is part 2 of my quest to find out if the GTX 960 is a 1080p gaming sweet spot on a budget. Last time I shared with you the performance of my previous graphics card, the GTX 560 Ti, on some of the games I currently play, and I also compared my old card to a GTX 760. In case you missed it, the link to that video is in the description, and in that video you can see what my old system specs are. Now it's time to see what the GTX 960 can do. Okay, I chose the MSI limited edition version of the GTX 960, and the first thing I noticed was this card is pretty big. I was so focused on the length, which is 10.5 inches, because I needed to be sure it would fit my old Cooler Master Mint Tower case. I never paid attention to the width dimension, so I was taken aback by how much larger the 960 is compared to the 560 Ti and 760. I chose the limited edition of the MSI version of the 960 because it comes with a nice looking backplate with a cool dragon logo, and it has a sweet dragon and MSI logo on the side that lights up green, very nice to show off in a clear side panel case. You can download an app to customize how you want the logo to light up or turn off completely if you find it distracting. Side note, the limited edition also comes with a decent sized Far Cry 4 gaming mousepad. Well, enough about the aesthetics and accessory for this MSI GTX 960, time to talk about performance. First off, I need to right a wrong from my previous video, and I realized while benchmarking The Witcher 2 with the GTX 960 that I forgot to turn off VSync with the other cards, which means the GTX 760 and 560 Ti could have probably given me better performance than what I previously highlighted. So in all fairness, the GTX 960 gets 31 frames per second on ultra settings with VSync on, and only 1 frame better with VSync off. However, on high settings there's a major difference. With VSync on, I get 58 frames per second, and with VSync off, I'm getting about 70 frames per second. Besides the higher frame rate, what I enjoy seeing from the 960 is a more solid experience versus the GTX 760. For instance, no matter which graphics card I use, The Witcher 2 suffers from some visual glitches as seen here, but I've noticed the GTX 960 does a much better job of alleviating those glitches than the older cards, and The Witcher 2 just looks much better because of it. Next up is Crysis 3. I didn't realize how CPU intensive this game is until talking about it with my buddy John while running these benchmarks, but I'm hoping my 3570K hasn't hindered the 960 results. Anyways, on very high settings I get around 43 frames per second, and at high settings I'm getting 67 FPS. This time with Battlefield 4 I decided to check out the benchmarks of the single player campaign besides the multiplayer offering. I was getting around 56 FPS on ultra settings in the single player, which is nice to see that I was close to and in some areas at 60 FPS at 1080p. In the multiplayer, the GTX 960 got around 70 FPS on ultra, and on high settings I got around 87 FPS. Like I said in part 1 of my GTX 960 videos, just remember the multiplayer frames per second vary from map and game mode. On a side note, I kinda wish more PC games had built-in benchmarks like Grid 2 to help make these types of videos easier to make. But anyways, the benchmarks for Grid 2 are 91 FPS on Ultra and 147 FPS on high settings, which is pretty sweet. Lastly, here are the benchmarks for Far Cry 4. On Ultra settings, I got 49 FPS. On very high settings, 58 FPS, on high settings, 62, and on medium settings, 76 frames per second. In my last video, I showed that the GTX 560 Ti is a 48% decrease in performance compared to the 760. What I was supposed to show is that the GTX 760 is basically a 97% increase in performance over the GTX 560 Ti. The GTX 960 is about a 17% increase over the GTX 760. So, what do these figures actually mean? On average, my GTX 560 Ti gets around 26 FPS on ultra settings in games I tested, while the GTX 760 gets almost 52 FPS, which is basically twice the performance. Comparing the GTX 960 to the GTX 760, in a demanding game like Witcher 2, I only get a 4 to 5 FPS difference. In a less demanding, nicely optimized game like Grid 2, I get a 14 FPS increase with the GTX 960, and with a more recent game like Far Cry 4, I get a 10 FPS increase. So this is a decent but not mind-blowing performance increase between the GTX 960 and its immediate predecessor. If you have a GTX 760, 770 or better graphics card, this is obviously not the best choice for an upgrade. Heck, even if you have a 2 generations old GTX 680, this is probably not the best upgrade. But then again, if you own an X80 class card, you're probably not looking at an X60 card anyways. What about future-proofing? 2GB VRAM is not enough. The 4GB version of the GTX 960 is out, but Nvidia only upgraded the VRAM and left the memory bus untouched. I have linked in the description to a detailed video comparison by Gamers Nexus of the GTX 960 2GB and 4GB versions. If you check out that video, please let them know I sent you their way. While the 4GB version doesn't have a huge performance gain for most titles tested at 1080p, there is a decent improvement at higher resolutions for certain games. My main concern with the 4GB version is that the price for those cards is directly competing with the 280X from AMD, which is still a better card regarding pure graphical performance. It's the second quarter of the year, and AMD is supposed to release some information about their 300 series cards. If you're patient, you could wait and see what the red team has up their sleeves and how it will affect prices of the current graphics cards out, including the 960. So is the GTX 960 a 1080p gaming sweet spot for gamers on a budget? For me, after all I've just said, it is. Moving from a GTX 560 Ti, this card is a sweet upgrade. So if you're in my shoes or building a budget PC with Nvidia hardware from scratch, and you've been eyeing this card, I have no reservations recommending it. Also, purchasing a GTX 960 from Amazon or other select retailers, you can get a redemption code to get a free copy of Witcher 3, but this also applies to other 900 series cards. What you're watching right now is what you get. Sweet graphics with some solid FPS performance at 1080p resolution. Later this month, when I can finally play Witcher 3, I'll be sharing my benchmarks for that game because I'm sure some of you are curious how the 2GB version of the GTX 960 will handle that game. So if you like this video, please click that thumbs up button and subscribe for more content to come. That's it for now. I'm out.